Metal attracts conspiracy theories because it looks dangerous. Most of them fall apart instantly. A few don't. Some refuse to die because the evidence never really disappeared. The PMRC. These guys didn't just warn parents. It reshaped metal forever. In the mid-1980s, the Parents Music Resource Center publicly framed itself as a consumer advocacy group. You know, if something's a scam, they're the jam. Officially, it came up to help parents understand lyrical content. Unofficially, it became one of the most effective censorship movements in modern American music history. The PMRC hearings in 1985 did not ban metal outright. What they did instead was more subtle. By forcing record labels to adopt the parental advisory label, they shifted risk onto artists and distributors. Retailers began refusing to stock albums. Radio stations avoided certain bands. Labels pressured artists to self-censor and remain commercially viable. This was anything but an accident. The goal was not education, but deterrence. Metal wasn't targeted because it was misunderstood. It was targeted because it was perceived as uncontrollable. The result was an industry-wide chilling effect that disproportionately affected metal, punk, and even hip-hop. Judas Priest. In 1990, Judas Priest stood trial after being accused of embedding subliminal messages in their music that allegedly caused two teenagers to kill themselves. Yeah, this one's pretty dark. The case was widely mocked, but its underlying implications were serious. The prosecution never demonstrated that subliminal messages could reliably alter behavior. Even the judge acknowledged this. What mattered was that the case made it to court at all. Internal industry documents later revealed that labels feared similar lawsuits and quietly encouraged artists to avoid lyrical ambiguity that could be legally weaponized. Judas Priest won the case, but the damage was already done. Metal musicians became legally vulnerable not for what they said explicitly, but for what someone could claim they implied. This was less about suicide and more about establishing a precedent that art could be held legally responsible for personal behavior. Scandinavian black metal violence. Early 1990s Norwegian black metal is often dismissed as media exaggeration. It shouldn't be. Church burnings did occur. Murders did occur. Key figures admitted involvement in both. Varg Vikernes was convicted of murder and arson. Church burnings were documented, investigated, and prosecuted. What remains disputed is intent. Some participants framed the violence as ideological resistance. Others admitted it was about notoriety. The conspiracy theory suggests the scene was infiltrated or amplified by outside forces. There is no evidence of state orchestration. What there is evidence of is media amplification creating feedback loops. Coverage rewarded extremity. Extremity escalated. Violence became cultural currency. Metal labels knew touring conditions were dangerous and did absolutely nothing. By the 1980s and 1990s, touring metal bands routinely reported unsafe travel schedules, stimulant abuse, and untreated mental health crises. These were not secrets. They were discussed openly in contracts and writer negotiations. Former tour managers and label employees have gone on record confirming that labels were aware of these risks. They accepted them as costs of production. When musicians died on tour or shortly after, the narrative defaulted to excess rather than exhaustion. The claim is that labels sacrificed artists for profit. The truth is less dramatic and more damning. Labels didn't need to conspire. They simply prioritized output over sustainability. The system worked as designed. Dave Mustaine's blacklisting was quietly enforced. Dave Mustaine has long claimed he was blacklisted after conflicts with industry figures in the 1980s. Publicly, this is often treated as paranoia. Privately, multiple radio programmers and label executives have acknowledged that Mustaine's reputation made him difficult to support. There was no memo, no official ban, just fewer promotional opportunities, delayed radio ads, and resistance at distribution levels. This kind of informational suppression leaves no paper trail, which is precisely why it works. The theory that metal musicians are quietly marginalized? In Mustaine's case, enough corroborating testimony exists to suggest this wasn't imagined. The Satanic Panic was never about Satan. During the 1980s and early 1990s, metal was framed as a vector for Satanism. Law enforcement seminars warned of ritual abuse. Daycare workers were prosecuted. Most cases collapsed under scrutiny. What persisted was the association between metal and moral danger. Sociologists studying the era have concluded that Satanic Panic functioned as a proxy fear about youth autonomy, changing gender norms, and declining institutional authority. Metal became the symbol because it was visible and defiant. No occult coordination existed, but the panic itself was real, and its impact on metal culture was lasting. Ozzy Osbourne was used as a test case for liability. Ozzy Osbourne's lawsuits over self-harm lyrics were repeatedly dismissed, but they established a legal framework for testing artistic responsibility. Industry lawyers later admitted that Osbourne's notoriety made him an ideal defendant. He wasn't targeted randomly, he was targeted strategically. Once the courts rejected liability, similar lawsuits became harder to pursue. Ozzy absorbed the legal pressure that might have otherwise fragmented across the industry. That isn't a conspiracy, it's legal triage. Metal was actively excluded from mainstream media post-Columbine. After Columbine, metal artists were questioned despite no evidence linking the perpetrators to the genre. Media outlets quietly reduced metal coverage. Programming shifted towards safer alternatives. Former MTV producers have confirmed that playlists were altered to avoid controversy. This wasn't censorship by law, it was risk management by corporations. Metal didn't disappear, it was simply pushed out of the center. Metal conspiracy theories tend to persist not because they are provable, but because the systems surrounding the genre rarely operate transparently. When explanations are informal, undocumented, or quietly enforced, speculation fills the gap. In some cases, that speculation tracks uncomfortably close to reality. The CIA and metal myth exists because the US government actually did weaponize music. There is no evidence that the CIA created metal bands or embedded messages in albums. That part is fiction. What is documented is that the US government has repeatedly used music as a psychological and political tool. Declassified records confirm that jazz musicians were sent abroad during the Cold War as cultural ambassadors. Rock music was broadcast into Eastern Bloc countries to undermine state-controlled media. Heavy metal itself was later used by US forces in Iraq and at Guantanamo Bay as a form of sleep deprivation and psychological pressure. This does not mean metal was designed as a weapon. It means the state recognized its capacity to overwhelm, agitate, and destabilize. The conspiracy survives because it contains a distorted version of a documented truth. Governments do study and deploy music when it suits them. Metal deaths are investigated differently, and that's not an accident. When metal musicians die, especially under ambiguous circumstances, coverage tends to emphasize lifestyle over causality. Overdoses are assumed. Accidents are framed as inevitabilities. Mental health factors are often retrofitted rather than examined. Forensic analysts and journalists have noted inconsistencies in how these deaths are handled compared to pop or classical artists. The presumption of excess reduces investigative pressure. Families have repeatedly reported difficulty obtaining full records or sustained attention. There is no evidence of a coordinated effort to cover anything up. There is evidence of systemic bias. Streaming algorithms do not treat metal neutrally. Streaming platforms insist their algorithms are genre agnostic. Studies of recommendation systems show that extreme genres with lower ad compatibility are less likely to be algorithmically promoted. Metal suffers twice. It is both sonically aggressive and culturally contentious. This reduces its perceived brand safety. As a result, metal artists rely more heavily on direct fan engagement and touring, even as touring becomes less viable. Metal festivals are quietly blacklisted by sponsors. Metal festivals consistently report difficulties securing sponsorships despite strong attendance and purchasing demographics. Marketing agencies have confirmed that metal audiences are often labeled high risk regardless of data. This classification persists even as metal fans age, gain purchasing power, and demonstrate brand loyalty. The stereotype is older than the evidence against it, but it continues to guide corporate decisions. Labels profit more from metal's marginalization than its success. Metal thrives best at scale, but labels have increasingly found it more profitable to keep it niche. A smaller, intensely loyal audience requires less marketing spend and produces predictable returns. Several former A&R executives have stated that metal is treated as a maintenance genre. It is not grown, it is managed. New acts are rarely pushed beyond a certain ceiling. This is not sabotage, it is containment. The problematic frontman narrative is convenient. Metal history is full of volatile personalities. When bands implode, blame often centers on a single figure. This narrative simplifies complex contractual, financial, and psychological pressures. By individualizing failure, institutions avoid scrutiny. The pattern repeats often enough to suggest utility. Whether intentional or not, the myth of the unmanageable artist protects the system that profits from them. Metal's exile was never official, but it was real. Metal was never banned. No law removed it from mainstream culture. Instead, it was gradually repositioned as a specialty product. Television reduced exposure. Radio segmented it. Streaming buried it under metrics. This approach avoids backlash while achieving the same outcome. Metal remains globally popular, financially viable, and culturally influential. It is simply no longer centered. That shift did not happen accidentally. Okay, that marks the end of today's untrue theories. Which of these did you find most interesting? Feel free to let us know in the comments section down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe before you leave. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.